Removing the Crashbox, which is fitted in front of the Lotus Elise, is quite a tedious job. It takes a bit of time to do it, and you have to disassemble the whole front of the car. In principle, you should place the car on a stand. Once you've got the car on the stand, then you can actually remove the inner wheel arches, followed by the clamshell, and then the radiator housing, which you can see over here, the radiator itself, and then finally you will have access to the Crashbox. So let me show you how it's done. Now, I've done already a few things, so let's assume we start with the car on a stand and with easy access. It's time to remove the quick access panels on the top of the clamshell. There's one on the left and there's one on the right, and there's about 3 screws to undo, and I guess everybody knows this part, so you can easily remove that. All right, on the left and on the right you have the inner wheel arches. It's a piece of plastic basically, which is fitted inside the clamshell, and you have these plastic kind of screws. It's a Phillips screw which is actually holding the inner wheel arch on the clamshell and on the body. So you have to remove about 5 or 6 of them, and then you can actually jerk out the inner wheel arch from underneath the clamshell and then remove it. This is not hard to do. The right hand side is easy, but on the left hand side you actually have the relay box and the fuse box fitted on top of the wheel arch right here. So that you have to undo with a few bolts, and it's hard to get at it, so you will have to get at it through the quick access panels that you have in the front on the top on the car. Removing the clamshell isn't that hard to do, and I've done it even without looking into the manual. But since you have removed the inner wheel arch, now you have access from the back to those 2 screws here, actually bolts and nuts. So those are the ones you will have to remove first, because the clamshell is actually here. The next thing to do is to remove the bolt on the top left corner of the clamshell, which is fitted just below the window screen on the corner. The top part of the clamshell is fitted and bolted down underneath the window frame with this screw. And that's the one you have to undo. It's a bit difficult to get at, but you can get from this side to it. It's not that hard, and also if you open up the door you can get partially to it. Now be very careful when you remove this screw, because what you have basically are shims, and these shims are fitted in between the shell and the chassis so that it's properly spaced. So make sure that you don't drop those, because you might want to reuse those. Now dropping parts is always an issue, and all the way down here there is a gap, and if pieces fall in there then you have a bit of a problem. So let me show you what I mean. So this is the gap I was referring to. So if you undo these bolts and nuts here, and then the top one underneath the window frame, then things may fall into this gap, and then you have to remove the whole thing. So what I typically do, I take a piece of cloth or paper, and you actually can fit it in there, so then things don't fall in it and you don't have to fish for them afterwards. We have removed the nuts and bolts on the side of the clamshell. We also removed the bolt with the shims on it, and now we just go along the edge of the front windscreen until we hit the next or the second bolt, which you need to undo, which is this one, and then you just carry along the edge of the window until you've done them all. Now remember, there's also a switch on the clamshell, and you will need to disconnect this cable from the actual switch on the clamshell. So if you carry on, then we're ending up on the middle of the car. In the middle of the car you have another fixture. There are 2 nuts fitted underneath here that are holding the middle of the clamshell into place. It's a bit hard to get to it, but you can do it from underneath, and you can undo both. So we removed all the parts on the left side, if you stand in front of the car, up to the middle, and we just go along the edge of the window frame. And then you undo this bolt, the same as on the other side, the bolt with the shims on the side, and then the two other ones that are holding the clamshell in place. And again, don't forget to put your little towel or whatever cloth in there in the gap so your pieces don't fall in. And then also don't forget to disconnect all the connectors on the switches that are connected to your front clamshell. And once you've done that, you basically have gone around. So now you need to remove some screws and bolts in the front of the clamshell, and that's a bit more difficult. One you can access from below, from within the wheel arch, but the other one you will have to undo the light fixture. So this is the protected plastic shield for the lights in the front of the car, and the actual lights are fitted into the clamshell. And one of the bolts that you have to undo to remove the clamshell is actually sitting right underneath this piece of plastic. So you have to remove the lens. And to do that, it's very simple. From the inside of the wheel arch, you basically have two screws to undo, and then you can pull off this plastic piece off the shell. Very easy to do, and then you have full access to the lights themselves and the light fixtures, because you will have to undo the wiring loom on those light fixtures. We removed the actual plastic protection for the lights, and now the light fixtures are visible inside the front clamshell. And if you look in the front of it, you will find this bolt. That's the bolt you would have to undo. This bolt is holding down the clamshell to the radiator housing. You need to undo this one, but you can't do it without removing the plastic protection for the lights first from the front clamshell. And the last screw to undo is one on the side here, which is also holding the clamshell in place. And you do exactly the same on the other side. Now, once you've done all that, you still have to retract and remove all the wiring harnesses that you have. And from the inside of the lights, this is this one, you need to disconnect them from the light fixtures, basically, and then pull out with the grommet the wiring loom actually from the clamshell. The same thing is true for all the other little connectors that you will see. And then basically you're ready to lift the clamshell off the car. With the front clamshell now being removed, we now have access to the radiator housing and the radiator. That's the part we now need to remove. So this is the front left side of the car, and you need to remove the hose from the radiator, and the hose is kept in place with this spanner, and it's hard to get it because you can't get to the screw, but this radiator housing has in the front two holes that allows you to put the screwdriver through and actually then remove or loosen up this ring. And then you can actually jerk off the radiator hose. If it doesn't go immediately, you can take a flat tip screwdriver and stick it in there and twiggle in between so it comes off. The other side is the same, but there you have front or top access. So this is the right hand side of the radiator, and again it's the same principle. You need to untighten this screw here and then jerk off the hose, but you can do it from the top basically. So in the front of the Elise, you will see the wiring harness for the lights, the front lights, and they are held in place with these plugs into the radiator housing, so you have to remove those before you can actually remove the radiator housing. At the back of the radiator housing, you also have a wiring harness which is tied down to these holders, and they are put in place with a tie wrap, as you can see. And you need to cut them so you can actually remove the wiring harness from the radiator housing. There's about 1, 2, 3, 4 places where they are tied down. It's easy, and afterwards you can just replace the tie wrap and put it all back. So that's a piece of cake. So now that we have disconnected the wiring harness from the radiator housing, we also have disconnected the wiring harness from all the lights, and maybe even the front lights you need to disconnect it, but you will see that. Just follow the harness and then you just disconnect it. Now it's time to actually unbolt the radiator housing and then just lift the whole thing up. One thing to remember, the bottom of the radiator is still having a fan on it. That is the cable you also need to disconnect. Removing the or unbolting the radiator housing is very simple. There are actually about 1, 2, 3, 4, about 4, 5, 6, 7 bolts or nuts to undo, and that's it. And then you just undo them. Just go around the cover and you'll see it, and then you can actually lift it up. So you need to pull back a bit the wiring loom or the wiring harness so it's not in your way. Make sure that the hoses are on the side, and then basically you can tilt up the whole thing. Now one trick that I do, I put my finger basically in the holes of the radiator so I can lift it along, and when it's lifted off a bit, then I remove the connector at the bottom of the ventilator. So, and then you can actually disconnect it, and here we go. You know, it's disconnected now. I don't know if you can see it. And then we lift it off, and you can see the ventilator on the bottom. So this is it. This is the Crashbox, now fully exposed, and we're almost ready to start cutting it off. You can't unbolt it because the Crashbox is actually bonded onto the front of the aluminum chassis with some special bonding glue, I would say. So you will need to cut it off in pieces, remove it gently, and then you're ready to put the new one on. But before doing so, there's 2 more things we need to do. It is the removal of an aluminum plate on the bottom of the Crashbox and some attachments on the sides. As you can see, the Crashbox is actually also attached to the aluminum part with some rivets. This aluminum part is actually the front of the chassis of the Lotus Elise. So we'll have to drill those out, or that one, it doesn't really matter. And then the last thing to do is to remove these bolts from underneath so the aluminum plate can come off. And we need to do this on both sides. And then basically you have full access to the Crashbox. If you look carefully, you see this black piece here, this kind of rubbery stuff. This is part of the adhesive stuff that is used to bond the Crashbox onto the aluminum chassis of the Lotus. And that's the kind of stuff we have to cut all off, clean it all up. So that's easy. So now we have the Crashbox fully exposed, and it's time to start cutting it off. I will cut it off in pieces, and then I will be very carefully remove the last part, because that's going to be tough where it's bonded onto the chassis with this kind of silicon-based, whatever, 3-component bonding stuff. But I'm going to be very careful when I'm cutting off things, because I don't want to damage anything. And the pieces I do cut off, I am not going to toss them away. The clamshell as well on this car was so badly damaged that I have to throw it away. But I'm going to keep it until the car is completely rebuilt, because there's always small pieces that you're going to need. For instance, the tow bar here, right? This is the part where you're towing your Lotus Elise with. That part alone costs you about €100 if you have to buy it new. So I'm just going to take it off and clean it up and put it on the new Crashbox if it doesn't have it, because I don't know if it comes with it or not. So let me start cutting. I will be cutting off the Crashbox with a kind of a saw blade, which is just vibrating, and I think that will be the best way to do it. So that's the first part. So now I can get closer up and see exactly what I'm doing to remove the remaining parts. It takes time to get it all off, but that's the only way to do it. It is going to take a little bit more time to get it all off, but once it's off, I'll clean up the front and then it's ready to mount the new Crashbox. And keep watching, because that will be my next video, mounting the Crashbox and putting it all back together. Thank you for viewing.